Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. My name is Keely Severson, and today I'm here chatting with the Exposing Mold Research and Education Director, Eric Johnson. We're just going to have a casual chat. Feel free to post questions in the comments. We'll discuss things mold related, but we're also just going to have a candid conversation how we would talk if nobody was here, really. Eric was kind of just sharing his thoughts on how technology can be destructive to communication. And I think that that's a really interesting conversation to have publicly because I see the way that the internet is helpful in that, well, one, it brought us together to work on this project and we've never even met in real life. But two, it's this double-edged sword and it is very destructive. One example that comes to mind is the way that everyone has an equal voice as an expert. And sometimes even in your own group, Eric, or on the Exposing Mold group, if we're having a teaching moment, almost anyone can kind of interject to dissuade the entire conversation. And I don't know if that's the point that you were making when you were saying how destructive the internet or this can be, but I'm sure you have a deeper insight that you were just about to share with me.
Well, yeah, that's basically it, is that everybody can spout their opinion and hit send and shoot it out across the electronic waves instantly without thinking about it. Back in the old days, if you wanted to have an opinion, you need to write it out with pen and paper, mail it. You had to think about what you're doing. And then you couldn't just send it out in an equal way to everybody. You had to have some kind of status as an expert or nobody would read it. Back in paper days, when the mold information started to get out, it came in the form of newsletters. And people had to really consider their sources, what they were putting down, whether it was correct, what their audience was. It was a very directed and orderly fashion. And the internet has utterly destroyed all that. And it's become a total free for all.
You know, it's interesting that we led with this just happenstance because of like the normal conversation we were already having before we went live, because this actually is kind of in accordance with something that I wanted to discuss with you, because somebody a while ago asked a question in our comment section and it was like, what is the best mold test? And as you know, you can't just answer that question with listing a test, right? But people do. Like the influencers online that follow our page just to try to get like coaching clients or whatever, they'll like drop their links, click my bio and find out all the perfect ways to test your house. And somebody who's maybe not well versed in the industry, who might not want to hear a more difficult answer, could be so easily misled like that. And I was just, I was hoping maybe you could spend some time explaining to people why the information that they do need might not be in a test. But to extrapolate on that further, what are some meaningful actions that people can take to show themselves if they're sick from their building without wasting money, without having the actual answers they're looking for?
Well, people have always been greedy. I mean, it's just how the species is. And there's always been a tension of people looking to dominate groups and twist the agenda over for their own ambitions at the expense of progressing science. And this was harder to do back in paper days. And now it is so easy to do that, as you say, anybody can just jump into the discussion and be an expert. In fact, it seems like 4 hours on the internet and everybody's ready to go into business as a new mold expert. And what they're missing is that back in the old days, mold didn't really seem to act this way. In fact, if you look in the old literature, the old books, to get sick from mold, you had to eat it. You had to ingest it in fairly large amounts too. The only cases where people really had a problem were things like farmer's lung or If you were in a super aspergillus infected building, you might get an infection, aspergillosis of the lungs. But that seemed to be the extent of it. Now we know that these reports of sick buildings, it's not like that. It's very different. People are walking into schools, into offices that look fairly normal, in fact, completely normal. You don't even smell anything in a lot of cases, and people become violently ill. Now, this was not something you could really miss, not even in the old days. Our grandparents were not stupid. And if a building was making them sick, they would say so, and that would leave a mark. And yet these reports just did not translate into the literature. And I think everybody who's been to their doctor who's experienced sick building syndrome can see that they're not being believed. The doctors don't know about it. Their family doesn't support them. Their friends never heard of it. So this indicates that something changed. This is a new paradigm. And when people rely on testing of what mycotoxins used to do, the normal toxins that molds have probably been putting out for millions of years, I think they're missing the boat because what they're not looking at is what mold is doing now. They're using what they think of mold doing back then as an implication that this must be what it is. And it's probably not that at all. I think we've got a new dynamic going on here where mold changed from something that kind of sat around and had to be eaten to be harmful into an inhalation biohazard. Something fundamental altered so that now this is in the air and bioavailable to your lungs, whereas it didn't used to be.
So you think testing isn't a good representation of the problem because the problem has changed and there is no testing that accurately reflects this change. And it's no longer primarily a problem of ingestion, it's a problem of inhalation, and something with mold changing to pass the blood-brain barrier is part of why people are more sick from mold than... Nico is trying to shake this tree. Than they were when it was just, I don't want to say just, but when it was more known to cause like allergies and pneumonia and stuff like that.
Exactly. And if you spend any time in groups, you see evidence that the testing of mold experts doesn't correlate to what people are reporting. There are so many people, even doctors, getting sick, and tests didn't find it until they finally broke into a wall and found Stachybotrys or high levels of mold. So the air testing wasn't working. The immunological findings that they were looking for didn't really tip them off to what was going on in their environment. And there are so many sick buildings out there where people go in and say, yeah, I feel something here. And the experts are going, no, our tests don't show anything. So the technology is not caught up to what we're really reporting.
I feel like that's frustrating for people to hear, that like petri dish tests are garbage, air testing can be super unreliable, no test can really accurately detect our problem. I feel like for the person just starting out and trying to figure out if this is why their family or kids are falling apart, that's like such a frustrating thing. And I know you never got into this to try to help families. You got into this to try to go straight to researchers so they could directly research this to help families. But what are some practical things that people can do instead of testing if they need to somehow validate this to themselves to believe mold's causing their symptoms, or gather more information that might be more meaningful or tell them more about what's happening?
Well, I'll tell you a story because we've got a perfect example of how this works. After Hurricane Katrina and all the flooding and people getting sick in mysterious ways, um, Joan Bennett, a mycologist, was getting sick in her flooded house. And she went through the normal testing and they didn't find anything. So she, relying on the experts, didn't convey any useful information to her because she could tell she's getting sick. But unlike most people, she's a mycologist and she's got a laboratory. So she did her own testing and found a toxin that they knew nothing about. It wasn't on their test. 1-octanthiol, sort of a mushroom toxin, something that she calls a volatoxin because it's volatile, it's inhaled, it's something in the air, and they knew nothing about it. So she proved the existence of this. It's now entered into the literature, but so far as I know, it's not being tested by any laboratory. No mold experts are talking about it. They're not warning you about it. Yet she already proved that she was getting sick from it. So here we've got a wonderful case of somebody with expertise demonstrating that these tests aren't adequate and they don't cover all the bases. And there's probably many other undiscovered mycotoxins out there that are affecting us that they know nothing about. So relying on your senses and trusting your own perceptions is still the only way to go.
Yeah, that reminds me of that time that you told me, like, we basically could never identify the full range of mycotoxins that mold currently puts out. And mold always has the ability to make new ones. So it's basically unlimited potential for damage that could never be captured in a test. That's interesting. So, what are some ways that people can rely on their senses then to give them more information?
Well, of course, there's the ones that the signs and symptoms that all mold experts are listing, which is if you feel headaches and rashes, inflammation, a general sense of unwellness, a catching the breath, coughing. If you have all these classic symptoms, then of course, this is your tip off that something's wrong in your environment. The fact that you feel it in your house or in your workplace, but not elsewhere, means that it needs some follow up here. And you need to start wondering, is this getting to the point where I'm really being damaged, where I need to take serious action and protect yourself and your family? So there's that, of course, but everybody knows about that now. What they don't know about is that certain molds produce atrinones and dolabellanes, which are purely immunosuppressive without the inflammatory signs and symptoms. They can shut down your immune response, kind of like cyclosporin, the anti-rejection drug, that all it does is it keeps your body from mounting an immune response, which is great if you're trying to keep yourself from rejecting a foreign organ, but not so great if you're trying to ward off a toxin or an antigen in your environment to keep some infection from getting a foothold. That is not what you need. And yet these toxins do exist. So sometimes the only warning that you've got is that you are getting sick for no apparent reason and doctors can't figure it out.
Man, that reminds me of my health this last year. Yeah. Well, I guess that kind of brings me to, the discussion of what you've taught about, I don't know how much we should get into this, but if I would have been putting into regular practice, leaving my house to see how I feel away from my house, I don't think I would have gotten as underwater as I did this past year after having Nico. Like, all the times that you've talked to me about a mobile environmental control unit, I remember you. It's like, you must have had some sense that something deeper was going on just by things that I would talk about privately to you and Alicia, because I remember you trying to like gently nudge me, like, I sure wish Keely had a mobile environmental control unit. I sure wish you could get a mobile environment. And it's like just one time for you to say something, because you're so gentle and you never try to like push things upon people, and you're never like, I feel like I know you well enough for you to have said it one time. I was like, oh shit, this is serious. He just advised me to do something. Like, if you give me a little advice, it's like, this is really serious. But what I wasn't making the connection of at that time when you were telling me like that you wish I had one of those was that if I was making more of a conscious effort to leave my house and go somewhere that was a little bit more clear and spending time there to see how I felt, maybe I would have caught the problem that I was having here sooner. And that's kind of how you use the mobile environmental control unit. And we can probably wrap up here a little bit after you just share your thoughts on this, because you're doing a whole webinar on this topic tonight. So I won't drown on and on and on about it. But maybe you can tell me a little bit about, like, did you know I was getting into trouble and that I needed to start leaving my house to figure it out? And like, not only that, but what is a MICU and how does it help in place of not wasting time and money on a bunch of testing?
Well, yeah, I did see some signs, and this it sneaks up on you. It really does, and it has snuck up on me because I don't want to live a crazy life. So I do my best to live in a normal house and do normal things and not take weird showers and run off to sleep in a camper all the time. But sometimes I could feel it sneaking up on me, and I would be tired and just not myself. And I could see the signs in other people too. And I'll tell you what, the MECU really is more than anything else, because people go, well, it's just a refuge. When you feel bad, you get out, and that's that. It's very simple and straightforward. Well, not really. It's a psychological training tool, because the more you escape a bad environment and get that sense of relief, the more it reinforces this behavior. And the more times you do it, the more adept you become at seizing the signs of slipping, of losing ground. And when you have a mobile environmental control unit available, you can test it so easily just by getting out of your house. And sometimes the relief is so immediately apparent that you get that stuck in your head. It's like, yeah, this is what's going on here. So now I'm not going to attribute it to my mental state or just things that happened externally, nothing like that. No, it's the environment.
I just think that's so important for people to consider, because I feel like even though I had a higher understanding of mold avoidance, I still got so far underwater. Exactly like you said, it snuck up on me. I even had clues such as like going for a drive and feeling better away from the house, that even I was justifying as something else, thinking it was like contamination in the house from different people in the house who were spending time in moldy buildings. And I needed to be more intentional about it. And I remember one time I was so sick over like late spring, you were like, why don't you just leave? And I'm like, leave? Why hasn't that occurred to me? And it's like, when you're that sick, it's like some part of your brain just turns off and you can't think. But then after I did leave that one time and went to a hotel and then started camping, it did exactly like you're saying, become more second nature. Like when I realized I was tasting that chemical taste around here, or I was getting super forgetful, I would just hop in the shower, change my clothes, and leave and go right to the park and spend as much time as I could out in fresh air, or grab a campsite for a couple nights. Just to try to get on top of it. And it's exactly like you said, the more I put it into practice, the more obvious what was going on with my house became, but also the more it became instinctual of don't just sit here feeling like shit, get out, what are you doing, and man, yeah, that's helpful when you don't even, it's helpful when you know you're sick and when you don't even know you're sick, because you haven't realized, because you got so far underwater without even realizing you got wet, which is so much of what this illness does to people, I think. So thank you, Eric. Is there what can you share a little bit about what you guys are going to talk tonight about in the webinar for anyone who might want to join the webinar tonight?
It's mostly just elaborating on what we covered, how an MECU is a training tool. It helps reinforce the behavior and allows you to take control of it. And amazingly enough, a lot of these mycotoxin pulses, they come in such a quick burst that when a house backs up or a building is bad, you can get out for just an hour or two and go back and find that it's less.
Mm-hmm.
So it's useful as a respite from these pulses. of badness, the amplification that we call it.
Mm-hmm. Will you be talking a little bit about the amp up tonight for people who aren't familiar?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. I'll be on the edge of my seat waiting. Thank you so much, Eric, for coming on today. I'll see you tonight.
Right.
Bye now.